The roast was still steaming when Sloane tapped her spoon against a wine glass and stood up. A hush rolled around the table, the kind that makes you hear your own breathing. I watched my daughter Avery shrink a little in her chair, hands folded in her lap like she didn't want to take up any more space than necessary. My mother beamed like we were all on stage under kitchen lights that made everything look better than it was. Sloane began to thank my parents, and I felt the mood tilt an inch, as if the floor had moved beneath us. I smiled on cue while Avery went still, eyes fixed on a spot in the table's grain. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of that month, I would stop pretending we were the kind of family that never kept score. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to hold your head high at a family table, tap that like and subscribe so I know I'm not the only one. My name is Nora Bennett, and I grew up in a house where the front porch was swept every Saturday, and the truth was tucked away in drawers, neat as folded dish towels. We were taught to say, please work hard and never let a neighbor see the mess, and I carried those lessons into adulthood like a well-worn purse, practical but heavier than it looked. When Avery came along, I promised her a simple kind of steadiness. Packed lunches, heat in the winter, a light on when she got home, and every receipt kept in a folder, because order at least was something I could control. We weren't wealthy, but I knew how to stretch a dollar without fraying it, and I saved for her future the way some folks collect heirlooms, slow and careful. My parents, Elaine and Robert, loved appearances, the kind that photograph holiday tables set with matching napkins, a curated calendar of milestones, while I learned to love the quiet wins: a paid bill, a reliable car, a weekend where nothing broke. Kara and I took different roads. She glided through rooms easily, always seemed to know who to call and what to post, and her daughter Sloane grew up in that glow, the favored granddaughter whose school plays turned into family events, while Avery stood near the doorway, holding a plate, happy for everyone else and trying not to be in the way. I told myself those were small things, that kindness would carry us across any gap between our modest apartment and my parents' tidy colonial. But even kindness can feel thin when the same hands get clapped for and the same hands get overlooked. Cedar Ridge has a way of pulling you into its rhythm: plowed streets by sunrise, church bells on Sunday, chatter in the grocery store, checkout about weather and high school scores, and I kept pace by showing up, working, saving, and keeping my voice even when I sat at my parents' table. Avery learned the same rhythm, though she added her own notes, the careful questions, and the habit of listening twice before she spoke. When she turned 18 in early spring, there was a quiet pride in our kitchen as she logged into her account for the first time. Years of deposits sat there like proof that patience works, and I told her it was hers to spend wisely, not as a leash, but as a promise kept. My mother planned a family dinner soon after, and I told myself it was just that dinner, not a measure of worth, so I brought a salad. Avery brought her polite smile, and we walked in from the cold as if the night would be easy. In the living room, the photographs on the mantel shone graduations, vacations, Sloane's half-birthday cake from years back, the one with the glitter candles, while Avery took the seat closest to me, fingers wrapped around her water glass like it could anchor her, and I settled into the practiced part of myself that knows how to nod, listen, and keep the peace. We passed dishes, traded small talk, and I watched Avery's shoulders soften just a bit when my dad asked about her favorite class, a tiny bridge across an old gap. Then the spoons clinked, and Sloane rose with that easy confidence that always earns a laugh before she says a word. She started to thank my parents for something big, and the air in the room changed in the way a sky changes before weather subtle, unless you're paying attention. I glanced at Avery and saw the light in her face narrow to something careful, her posture straightening, as if bracing against a breeze. My mother touched Sloane's elbow, the picture of pride, and my father lifted his glass eyes, soft with approval. At the edge of the table, Avery's hand slipped from her water, resting flat the way a person steadies a page before a signature. Sloane flashed a smile that asked for applause and told us she had taken a step into her own future, and the room answered the way it always does, with cheers, with congratulations, with a chorus that makes everything sound simple. Avery didn't join the chorus. She held still, as quiet as a held breath, and I reached beneath the table to give her knee a gentle press, the small signal we'd used since she was little to say, "I see you." Her reply was a barely there nod, eyes lowered to the table's surface where the overhead light pooled like a spotlight. My mother's voice skimmed across the moment, smooth and reassuring, and for a second I let it carry me the way a familiar song carries you back to the chorus, because sometimes it's easier to hum along than question the lyrics. But a ripple had already moved through Avery, and a mother learns to recognize the difference between ordinary nerves and the quiet of someone doing careful math in her head. I told myself we would talk later at home, where the sounds of the dishwasher and the soft knock of heat in the vents make room for harder truths. Sloane finished toasting, we clinked glasses, and I swallowed a smile that didn't sit right, as if it had been pinned to the wrong dress. By dessert, Avery had thanked my mother for the invitation, risen from her chair, and asked if I minded if she headed out early, just needed some fresh air. I watched her slip on her coat and step into the cold, not knowing yet that a door had opened behind her too, one that would lead us to a place where kindness would need something stronger beside it. When Avery left that night, I thought it was just the exhaustion of family noise, the kind that hums beneath every polite laugh and clink of silverware. I stayed to help clear the dishes, folding napkins and rinsing glasses, still hearing the echo of Sloane's announcement. My mother's voice floated through the kitchen, cheerful and measured, as if the night had been a success. I smiled where I was supposed to, careful not to ask the questions that flickered through my mind. When I finally got home, the house felt still, too still. The kitchen light was on, and Avery sat at the table in her jacket shoulders, stiff, her phone face down, beside an untouched cup of tea. I eased into the chair across from her. "You okay, honey?" I asked softly. She didn't answer right away, just stared at the table like she was searching for a place to start. Then she looked up, eyes rimmed red. "Mom," she said, voice trembling. "I gave Grandma my college fund." The words hung there, impossible at first, and I wasn't sure I heard her right. "All of it," I whispered. She nodded. $43,000. I wired it to her last week. It was a strange kind of quiet that followed not disbelief, not anger, just a heaviness that made the air hard to breathe. I reached across the table, but she didn't move. Her voice came smaller this time, the way it did when she was little and afraid of disappointing me. She said she needed surgery, something serious. She said insurance wouldn't cover it, and she didn't want anyone to worry. I wanted to help. I could almost see it the way my mother must have spoken, the carefully chosen pauses, the gentle guilt woven into every word. Avery's hands twisted in her lap. "She told me not to tell you," she said, "because you'd make a fuss, that you already have enough on your plate." She took a deep breath, blinking fast. I wasn't scared. I just wanted to do something good. Her phone buzzed, and she turned it toward me. On the screen was a transfer confirmation, $43,000. "Memo for surgery. Hope you're okay." The sight of it made my stomach turn. I didn't cry, not then. I couldn't. "You were lied to," I said quietly, each word. Slow. Certain. Avery covered her face, and her shoulders began to shake. "I thought I was helping her," she whispered between tears. "You were," I said, moving to her side. "You just gave it to the wrong person." She leaned into me, trembling, and I held her, my mind racing. I'd spent my life defending small cruelties in that house, excusing them as quirks, old habits, generational differences. But this was different. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theft disguised as family love. That night, I didn't sleep. Avery finally dozed off on the couch, still wearing her hoodie, her hands tucked beneath her chin like she was bracing for something. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every memory of my mother replaying in sharp, painful clarity. I remembered the little ways she'd measured affection, how Sloane got a charm bracelet for being such a bright star, while Avery's birthday card arrived 3 days late, with "Best wishes, Gigi" scrawled in the corner. How Sloane's baking earned her a drawer in the kitchen labeled "Sloane's Supplies," while Avery's cupcakes were met with, "Oh, honey, I'm cutting back on sugar." I remembered the year Sloane got a half birthday party balloons, a full cake, even a $100 bill in a glittery card. That same summer, Avery's real birthday got a late-night call. We forgot what day it was, my mother had said, laughing it off. I had laughed too, pretending it didn't sting. I told myself love came in different forms, that my parents' hearts just worked differently. But lying awake that night, I realized it wasn't difference. It was choice. When I got my first real job, the calls from my parents had started. Just a little short this month. Can you help with Sloane's recital fees? Each time I said yes, thinking that's what family does. I thought love meant covering the gaps, being dependable. I didn't see the pattern forming the slow shift where one child became the giver and the other the receiver. I told myself it was temporary, that someday it would balance out. It never did. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The sun had barely lifted over the snow when I grabbed my keys and drove across town to my parents' house. Frost glazed the windshield, and my fingers shook on the steering wheel. I didn't call first. I didn't plan what I'd say. I just knew I needed to look my mother in the eye. She opened the door and her robe hair pinned up a mug in her hand. Her eyes flickered with surprise. "Nora?" she said, smiling faintly. "Everything okay?" I stepped inside without answering. "Did you ask Avery for her college fund?" The question hung between us like smoke. Her expression didn't change. She offered. She said calm as if she were talking about the weather. "She's such a thoughtful young woman. You raised her well." "She gave it to you because you told her you needed surgery," I said. My voice was steady, but my heart hammered in my chest. "I never said I had an appointment," she replied, turning toward the kitchen. "I said I'd been in pain." "That's not a lie. You told her not to tell me," I said. "You told her it was urgent and private." She stirred her tea, her tone even. "She's 18, Nora. She can make her own choices." I took a step closer. "So, there's no surgery?" She looked at me for a moment, then shrugged. "Not right now, but I might need one someday." Something in me went cold. I laughed once quietly. "You lied to her," I said. "You took everything she saved because she believed you were dying, and now you're pretending it's generosity." Her jaw tightened. "Don't be dramatic. She wanted to help. You've always made things bigger than they are." I felt something settle inside me then, not rage, clarity. "She gave you $43,000, I said, because she thought you were in pain. You let her believe that." "She'll understand when she's older," she said softly, almost kindly. "Helping family is never a mistake." I stepped back. "She won't understand," I said, "because she didn't help family. She was used by them." I didn't wait for her reply. I turned and walked out, leaving the warmth of the kitchen behind me. When I got home, Avery was still at the counter, her cereal soggy in the bowl. "Did you talk to her?" she asked. I nodded. "There's no surgery." She stared down at her spoon for a long time. "That's what I thought," she said quietly. We didn't say anything else for a while. The sound of the clock filled the silence. That night I stood at the window and watched snow drift over the streetlights. I thought the hardest part was over, that naming the lie would be enough. But I was wrong. 4 days later, a text from my aunt arrived, one line that cracked the stillness wide open. "Your mom said Avery gave her a small loan and is suing her for attention. Please tell me that's not true." I read it twice, each word sinking like a stone. Avery hadn't just been betrayed, she was being rewritten. The people who raised me were already turning her generosity into a story that made them the victims. I put the phone down and looked at my daughter sitting across the room, reading the soft light catching the edge of her hair. She didn't see my face yet, didn't know what new storm was coming. The quiet between us deepened heavy with what neither of us knew how to say. And somewhere inside that silence, I realized this wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about what kind of truth would survive once the whispers began. The message from Aunt Joyce came on a Tuesday afternoon, short and careless, as if it were nothing more than neighborhood chatter. "Your mom said Avery gave her a small loan and is suing her for attention. Please tell me that's not true." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, reading it again just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. They weren't just lying, they were rewriting the story before the truth had a chance to take root. Avery was at the table, half buried in a psychology textbook, her pencil tapping a slow rhythm. I set my phone down and said her name softly. She looked up, eyes clear but tired, the kind of tired that settles deeper than sleep can fix. I told her what Aunt Joyce had written. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Her voice came quiet and steady, like she'd already known this was coming. "They think I did this for money," she said. There was no anger in it, just disbelief stretched thin across exhaustion. "They're scared," I said, choosing each word carefully. "The truth makes them look smaller than they want to be." Avery's pencil rolled from her hand and clattered on the floor, breaking the stillness that hung between us. She bent to pick it up, her movement slow and deliberate, as if controlling the only thing left she could. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table with our laptops open. I began gathering everything: the transfer record, the text from my mother, asking her not to tell me the date of Avery's 18th birthday stamped at the top of every message. I took screenshots, organized files, labeled each one. I didn't add commentary, didn't need to. The truth spoke loudly enough in plain text. When the files were ready, I sent them to the relatives who had asked questions instead of spreading rumors. A few replied with short messages, "Oh my," or "I had no idea," but most said nothing at all. Some stopped calling altogether. People love a scandal more than they love clarity, and silence is the easiest way to stay comfortable. A few days later, my phone buzzed with Kara's name. For a second, I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. "Look, I don't know what Mom told you," she began, her tone sharp and defensive. "But the money was a gift. Sloan didn't ask for it. None of us did." I held the phone tighter. "It wasn't a gift, Kara. It was stolen from an 18-year-old who thought she was saving her grandmother's life." Kara sighed. "You're overreacting. Mom told me she'd planned to pay her back eventually. You can't just go around accusing family like this." "She didn't plan to pay it back," I said evenly. "She used it for Sloane's down payment." "That's not a loan, it's fraud." There was a pause, followed by a quiet scoff. "Why would we give it back now?" "The money's gone. It's not like anyone forced her." The words landed with a dull thud, and before I could answer, she added, "You don't control Mom and you don't control me," and hung up. The line went dead, leaving me with the faint hum of the dial tone and the weight of a truth that no one wanted to carry. That night, Avery sent Sloan a message. She showed it to me before pressing send. It was short and polite. "Did you know where the money came from?" The reply came almost instantly. "Grandma said it was hers to give. Nothing more, nothing less." Avery set the phone face down, the blue glow fading from the table. She didn't cry this time, didn't ask questions. She just sat quietly, her expression unreadable. "It's not the money," she said, finally, voice thin as paper. "It's that they're all okay with it." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to soften. Over the next week, we stopped waiting for apologies. Instead, we documented everything. Avery created a folder labeled Evidence, and I started calling attorneys. One after another turned us down: too small, too personal, too messy. But finally, a young attorney named Eric Dalton agreed to meet. He didn't promise miracles, just fairness. "If this were any other relationship, it would be called financial exploitation," he said after looking through the file. "The only difference is blood." Avery sat beside me during that meeting, quiet but steady. Her nails were bitten down to the quick, but she didn't fidget. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she said. "I just want what's right." Dalton nodded. "You're not hurting anyone. You're protecting yourself." The first time I saw her sign the legal forms, I felt a strange mix of pride and grief. Her hand didn't shake, but mine did. She was 18 barely and already learning how much strength costs. Word spread fast once the papers were filed. My mother stopped calling entirely, though I heard she told the neighbors we were dragging the family name through the mud. My father sent a single text that read, "I wish you'd kept this private." I didn't answer. Privacy was what allowed all of this to happen in the first place. One afternoon, a mutual friend told me my parents were confused and heartbroken. The words sounded borrowed, like something rehearsed for sympathy. But the truth was simple. They weren't confused at all. They were just used to being believed. Avery and I spent our evenings quietly, the house filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock. She studied late, still keeping up with her classes, though I could tell the strain weighed on her. Sometimes I caught her staring at the ceiling, her expression distant. "Do you ever think we'll forgive them?" she asked once. I took a long breath before answering. "I think forgiveness has to wait until there's honesty," I said. She nodded slowly, like she understood more than I wished she did. The day the court papers were served, snow had started falling again. I watched through the window as the delivery car pulled away from my parents' neat little house across town. Inside, the world felt strangely quiet. Avery sat beside me on the couch, pulling a blanket over her knees. She didn't say much, just leaned against me and whispered, "I don't want to sue, Grandma." "I know," I said softly, "but sometimes the only way to stop something like this is to shine a light on it." She nodded, eyes fixed on the falling snow. The house was still except for the faint hum of the furnace and the rustle of paper as I folded the last copy of our statement into an envelope. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. There would be no going back to birthday dinners or polite conversations. But as I watched Avery that night, her chin lifted her shoulders square despite the fear, I realized something had shifted. She wasn't waiting to be rescued anymore. She was standing on her own, even in the wreckage. And somewhere deep down, I knew the real fight hadn't even started yet. The days leading up to the hearing blurred into a rhythm of paperwork and quiet tension. Avery moved through the house like someone walking on glass, steady, careful, aware of every sound. I tried to keep things normal, but even the smallest noise like the kettle whistling or the mail slot snapping shut made us both flinch. Our world had shrunk to a handful of rooms and a growing file of evidence sitting on the kitchen counter. The morning of the hearing came colder than expected. A thin layer of frost covered the car windows, and Avery stood beside me in her navy blazer, smoothing the fabric over and over like it might protect her. She didn't say much on the drive. The courthouse wasn't far, but the silence made it feel miles away. When we walked through the glass doors, the smell of polished wood and faint disinfectant filled the air. I glanced at her chin-up eyes forward and saw the kind of composure that only comes when there's no other choice. We arrived too early. Avery wanted to sit in the hallway outside the courtroom, so we did our coats folded across our laps. She clutched her small leather bag like it was something to hold her together. I could see the corner of the folder inside neatly labeled, her handwriting precise. The minutes passed slowly, marked by the sound of heels on tile and the occasional echo of a closing door. When the bailiff finally called our case, Avery inhaled deeply and stood. My knees felt weak, but I followed. Inside, my parents were already seated at the defense table. My mother wore pearls, her hair perfectly arranged. My father avoided my eyes, busying himself with a pen he didn't need. Their attorney, a man named Craig Holloway, greeted us with a practiced smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. When the judge entered, everyone stood. I felt the weight of the moment press into the quiet, as if even breathing too loudly might shift it. Mr. Holloway spoke first. His voice was smooth, confident, rehearsed. He called it a tragic misunderstanding, painting a picture of a devoted grandmother and a granddaughter who had grown confused about her own generosity. He said Avery had offered the money out of love, and that I, the mother, had poisoned her perception afterward. I watched Avery's hands tighten in her lap, her knuckles pale against the dark fabric of her blazer. Then Holloway produced photos, pictures pulled from her social media. In one, she smiled at a friend's birthday party, a paper crown tilted on her head. In another, she held a mocktail and laughed. "Does this look like someone traumatized?" he asked the judge. Before I could stand, the judge's voice cut through the air. "Counselor, let's stay with the facts." The words landed like a door closing. When it was our turn, Eric Dalton stood adjusting his glasses. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your Honor," he began. The plaintiff, Avery Bennett, transferred $43,000 to her grandmother after being told the money was needed for urgent uninsured surgery. She was 18, newly independent, and had no reason to believe her grandmother would deceive her. Then he gestured toward Avery. "Miss Bennett, please step forward." She rose, her movements steady but deliberate. I could see her hands trembling slightly as she took the stand. The clerk swore her in, and she unfolded a printed screenshot from her bag. Her voice was quiet but clear as she read, "For surgery." "Hope you're okay." The courtroom stayed silent. She looked up, meeting the judge's eyes. "She told me she was in pain," Avery said softly, "that she couldn't afford treatment. She said she didn't want my mom to worry." Eric nodded gently. "Did you believe her?" "Yes," Avery answered. "She's my grandmother. I thought she was being brave about it." The judge turned toward my mother. "Mrs. Bennett was there, a scheduled surgery." My mother hesitated. eyes flicking toward her lawyer before answering. "No, not scheduled, but I've had symptoms. Have you seen a doctor?" the judge asked. "I can't recall the name," she said. "Was there a diagnosis?" She shifted in her chair. "I didn't want to worry the family," she murmured. "And you accepted $43,000 from your granddaughter without informing her mother." My mother's shoulders stiffened. "I didn't think she'd want me to refuse," she said. "Did you use any of that money for medical expenses?" The question lingered unanswered for a beat too long. My father looked down. My mother's lips parted, then closed again. Finally, she said, "It's complicated." The judge leaned forward, voice calm but sharp. "Mrs. Bennett, did you or did you not use those funds toward a down payment on a property purchased by your other granddaughter, Miss Sloane Mitchell?" A flush rose along my mother's neck. "It was a coincidence," she said. The judge wrote something on his pad, then looked up. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Avery Bennett. The defendants are ordered to repay the full amount plus legal fees. It is the judgment of this court that the funds were obtained under false pretenses through deliberate misrepresentation." For a long second, no one moved. The sound of the gavel struck once sharp final. My mother gasped quietly. My father bowed his head. Avery sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the bench, afraid to move, as if any sound might undo it all. As we stood to leave, I heard a whisper behind me. My mother's voice, low but urgent, directed at Sloane. "We'll fix this. Just give it back for now. We'll repay you after we sell the car." And Sloane, clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, replied, "You told me it was your money. You lied to me too." The words echoed softly through the room as we walked toward the doors. Avery didn't look back, and neither did I. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a shock. We reached the car, and Avery finally let out a long, trembling breath. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the courthouse steps as if memorizing them. I opened the door for her, and she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes on the road ahead. As I started the engine, snow began to fall again, light and steady. The sound of it against the windshield filled the silence between us. I thought about everything that had led us there, the phone calls, the whispers, the months of doubt, and realized the verdict wouldn't erase any of it. But it was something solid, something honest. When we pulled into our driveway, the porch light was still on. Avery turned toward me and said softly, "I don't think it feels like winning." I nodded, gripping the steering wheel. "It doesn't," I said, "but it feels like truth." She leaned back, her eyes closing for a moment, and I watched the snow gather on the hood of the car, small white flecks dissolving against the warmth. Somewhere behind us, doors were closing, stories shifting. And ahead, though neither of us could see it yet, a different kind of quiet was waiting, one that didn't come from fear. The snow melted quickly that week, leaving the sidewalks wet and streaked with grit. Life should have started to feel lighter after the verdict, but the air in our house was heavy in its own way, quiet, cautious, waiting for what would follow. Avery moved through the days like someone learning how to breathe again. She still went to class, still smiled when neighbors waved, but there was a distance behind it now, a guarded calm that hadn't been there before. I noticed the difference in small things. She double-checked locks before bed, reread instructions before signing anything, paused before answering questions. Her kindness hadn't gone anywhere. It had just learned to carry armor. I tried to give her space to find her rhythm, cooking her favorite meals, talking about ordinary things like laundry and weekend plans. But underneath, we both knew life wasn't the same. The first sign of what came next arrived in whispers. Aunt Joyce called one evening, her voice caught between concern and gossip. "Your mom's been telling people she's being punished for being too generous," she said. "That you two turned on her after she gave Avery money for college. She says she's heartbroken." I thanked her for calling, though my throat ached by the end of it. People will believe the story that costs them the least. A week later, my parents' house went on the market. The listing popped up online with bright photos, the white colonial gleaming against a clear blue sky, the flower boxes freshly painted, the welcome sign polished. It looked like a picture of innocence. The realtor's note read, "Immaculate family home, lovingly maintained, motivated sellers." The for sale sign was planted right in the middle of the front yard, the same spot where Avery had once built a snowman years ago, while my mother watched from the window correcting where she'd put the scarf. Now the house stood as if nothing had ever gone wrong inside it. When the sale closed 2 months later, they moved into a small rental on the edge of town. It was an older place with peeling paint and a narrow porch that leaned slightly to one side. I didn't see it in person, didn't need to. Word spread fast enough through the family, passed from one call to another. Kara called once, just once. "They're having a hard time," she said, her tone edged with guilt she didn't quite claim. "Mom's trying to keep her head up." I waited thinking maybe she'd ask how Avery was, maybe even apologize. She didn't. Instead, she sighed and said, "I've got my own mortgage, Nora. I can't get pulled into this circus." Then she hung up before I could answer. Sloane stayed quiet. I heard she'd moved into her new house, 3 bedrooms, a small garden close to her new job. A few mutual friends mentioned how she'd kept her distance from my parents after the hearing. I didn't blame her. She was young, and even though she'd benefited from their lies, she'd also been caught in them. Some lessons burn everyone standing too close. The gossip didn't stop, though. One of my mother's friends, a woman named Helen Parker, mailed me a card written in perfect cursive. The note inside said, "I hope one day your daughter forgives herself." What a shame to take something so trivial to court. Trivial. The word sat heavy in my hands. I folded the card neatly and slipped it into a drawer with the rest of the paperwork proof that some people will always see fairness as betrayal. I stopped responding to messages after that. The energy it took to defend the truth wasn't worth losing sleep over. Instead, I poured it into Avery. She needed quiet, not explanations. She filled her time with schoolwork and part-time shifts at a bookstore downtown. On weekends, she'd sit at the kitchen table reading about behavioral psychology, highlighting lines that seemed to speak to her more than the lessons themselves. One night, I found her sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the streetlights flicker through the branches. "Do you think they'll ever say sorry?" she asked without turning. Her voice was soft, but there was no hope behind it, only curiosity. I sat beside her. "I don't know," I said, "but I think they've already said enough." She nodded slowly, her breath rising in the cold. "I used to think forgiveness was automatic," she said, "like you had to give it to be a good person. Now I think it's earned." We sat there until the air grew too sharp to stay. When we went inside, she stopped at the drawer where I kept the old family photos. She pulled one out, a picture of her 7th birthday frosting on her cheek, my mother's hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Avery looked at it for a long time before sliding it back into the drawer and closing it. Spring came late that year. The court-ordered repayment trickled in through monthly transfers. Each time it arrived, I moved the money into a college account under Avery's name untouched, except for school expenses. We never spoke about it in detail. The silence around it felt like a boundary neither of us wanted to cross. My parents didn't reach out, not once, but stories about them drifted through the small town like wind through cracks. How my father spent afternoons at the library reading old newspapers, how my mother had joined a local quilting group where she was the sweetest thing. People believed what they saw in front of them, not what hid beneath it. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if I'd gone too far. On quiet nights when the house was still, I'd replay that courtroom scene, the gavel, the silence after, and wonder if peace could have been bought with silence instead of justice. But then I'd remember Avery's face when she first showed me that memo line for surgery. "Hope you're okay," that single red heart. And the doubt would dissolve. Avery began to change in ways I hadn't expected. She grew more cautious, but also more certain. She checked her bank accounts weekly, read the fine print on everything, and never let a promise go unverified. She wasn't bitter, just wiser. When friends asked why she never talked about her grandparents, she'd smile gently and say, "I learned a lot about trust early." Our evenings became quieter. Some nights we cooked together music, playing low laughter, easy, but never forced. Other nights she studied while I sat nearby with a book I didn't really read, just listening to her pen scratch across the paper. The silence that used to frighten me started to feel like safety. No more phone calls pretending at love, No more dinners filled with careful politeness. Just us, steady, honest, and healing at our own pace. Still, I knew the story wasn't over. Families like ours never end cleanly. They taper off into echoes that last longer than anyone admits. I could feel another reckoning coming, one not measured in money or court orders, but in memory, in what we choose to keep and what we finally let go. One night after dinner, Avery asked if she could visit the old neighborhood before graduation. Just to see it, she said. I looked at her for a moment, seeing both the little girl she'd been and the woman she was becoming. I agreed. When we pulled up to the curb in front of my parents' old house a week later, the new owners had already painted the shutters a darker shade of blue. The flower boxes were empty, waiting for spring. Avery stood on the sidewalk, her hands in her pockets, eyes tracing the outline of the porch. They used to make me stand right there for pictures, she said quietly. I remember thinking the house looked bigger back then. We stayed just long enough for her to take one slow breath of the air that had once felt like home. Then she turned toward the car. "I'm ready to go," she said. And as we drove away, I realized she wasn't just leaving that street behind. She was stepping into something entirely her own, something stronger than what they tried to take from her. What neither of us knew yet was that the hardest part of healing wouldn't come from what was lost. It would come from learning how to live without the need for their approval at all. By summer, the gossip had cooled, but the air between us and the rest of the family stayed sharp. People no longer asked questions. They just avoided them. That kind of silence doesn't sound loud until it follows you into every grocery aisle and church pew. Avery noticed it too, the long stares that ended when she turned around, the polite smiles that dissolved when we walked past. But she carried herself differently now, not shrinking under it, just quieter, more deliberate. She'd started her second semester at the University of Wisconsin and was home for the long weekend. I picked her up from the bus stop, and as soon as she climbed into the car, I noticed she was different. Her hair was pulled back, her shoulders straighter, her voice steady. When she talked about her classes, it wasn't with the nervous excitement she used to have. It was with the kind of certainty that comes after being tested. That night we sat on the porch after dinner, the sound of crickets filling the air. "You ever think about what they're doing now?" she asked, her eyes on the dark stretch of the street. I thought about my parents' small rental on the outskirts of town, the chipped paint, the quiet that must have filled their days. Sometimes I said, "But not the way I used to." She nodded, her jaw tightening. "I saw Grandma at the grocery store last week," she said finally. "She didn't see me, or maybe she pretended not to." I felt my stomach tighten. "Did she say anything?" Avery shook her head. "She was with someone from church. She looked normal, like nothing ever happened." I reached for her hand, but she was already looking away. "I don't know why it still bothers me," she said softly. "It shouldn't, but it does." Her voice trembled just slightly, not from weakness, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes after too much pretending that something doesn't hurt anymore. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail, postmarked from Madison. The handwriting was my mother's, neat and controlled. For a long moment, I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity won. Inside was a single page folded perfectly in thirds. "We've had time to think. Families shouldn't stay divided over money. We hope Avery is ready to talk. Maybe we can work something out." No apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done, just a plea wrapped in pride. I left it on the counter, unsure what to do. When Avery came home that evening, she noticed it instantly. "Is that from her?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't touch it, just stared at the envelope like it was something fragile that might burn through the table. "You can read it if you want," I said, "or I can throw it away." She hesitated, then slid the letter out and read it silently. When she finished, she set it back down and walked to the sink. "They still don't get it," she said quietly. "It's not about the money." She turned on the tap and ran her hands under the cool water as if to wash off the weight of the words. The next morning, she asked me to drive her to the university early. The highway stretched out empty in front of us, fields on either side, the sunrise pulling gold across the horizon. She stared out the window, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "I think I want to change my major," she said. "Psychology feels right, but I want to focus on family systems, why people repeat harm and call it love." I glanced at her and saw the quiet determination in her eyes. "You'd be good at that," I said. "You already understand more about people than most do." She smiled faintly, the first real one I'd seen from her in a while. Maybe she said, "I just want to understand how people can justify what they did to us and still sleep at night." As the months passed, the space between us and my parents became its own kind of peace. No phone calls, no birthdays, no guilt tangled in the sound of a ringing phone. Just silence, clean and complete. I started to realize that peace doesn't always look like forgiveness. It sometimes just looks like not having to explain yourself anymore. In late fall, Aunt Joyce called again. Her tone was careful, like someone walking across thin ice. "I ran into your mother," she said. "She mentioned the house sold faster than expected, but they're struggling with rent now." She sounded tired. I didn't respond right away, and Joyce hesitated before adding, "She asked if I thought Avery might visit." I could hear the hope in her voice, small but persistent. "She's focusing on school," I said simply. Joyce sighed. "It's a shame, Nora. None of this had to go that far." I thanked her for checking in and ended the call before the weight of old guilt had the chance to settle in again. That night I told Avery about the conversation. She didn't say much at first. Then she looked at me and said, "They chose this mom, not us." Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes when the heart has accepted what the mind already knew. We didn't talk about it again. Instead, we focused on small things: the first snow, her midterms, the smell of cinnamon from the pies we baked on Sundays. Life became ordinary again, in the best possible way. One afternoon I stopped by the bookstore where Avery worked. She was behind the counter laughing softly with a customer, her hair pulled into a loose bun, a pencil tucked behind her ear. When she saw me, her face lit up. That moment, so simple, so free of shadows, felt like a turning point. She was healing, even if she didn't call it that. On the drive home, I thought about how easily a person can rebuild once the noise of old expectations fades. There were no apologies, no reunions, but maybe we didn't need them. Some wounds don't close because of words. They close because you finally stop touching them. A few weeks later, the final repayment came through. The total balance was restored, every cent accounted for. The court file was officially closed. Avery stared at the notice for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. "Can we be done now?" she asked. "Completely done." I nodded. "We already are." That winter, as the new year approached, she applied for a summer research program in Chicago, one she might not have dared to before all this. When the acceptance letter came, she stood in the kitchen, holding it, her smile quiet but sure. "They only took 10 students," she said. I guess I made it. I pulled her into my arms, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the tension of what we'd lost. I just felt proud. Later that night, when the house had gone still, I stood by the window watching snow drift across the streetlights. There was no celebration, no grand ending, just the quiet understanding that we had survived something that once felt impossible. What I didn't know then was that survival wasn't the finish line. Healing had its own path to walk, and the next step, though quieter, would ask us to face something even harder: how to let go without needing closure from those who would never offer it. Winter in Cedar Ridge has a way of making time feel slower. The snow dulls, sound softens the edges of everything, and gives even the smallest movement a kind of weight. That December, the cold came early and stayed late. Avery was finishing her finals, spending long nights in the library, while I kept her favorite meals warm in the fridge for when she got home. Life had settled into a quiet kind of normal, steady, predictable, almost peaceful. But peace has a strange way of being fragile. It takes just one reminder to bring back everything you thought you'd already buried. Ours came in the form of a phone call one evening just before Christmas. The number was local, unfamiliar. I almost didn't answer. When I did, a voice I hadn't heard in over a year filled the line. "Nora, it's Mom." For a moment I couldn't speak. She continued before I could respond. "I wanted to let you know your father's been in the hospital. Nothing serious, just a fall. He's fine, but I thought you'd want to know." Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed. I asked which hospital, and she gave me the name St. Michael's. He slipped on the ice outside the store, she said. They kept him overnight for observation. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam rising from my mug. I hadn't expected guilt to feel so familiar. Avery came in a few minutes later, coat still on, cheeks pink from the cold. "What's wrong?" she asked. I told her about the call. She didn't flinch, didn't look angry, just quiet. "Are you going to go?" she asked. I thought for a moment before shaking my head. Not yet. 2 days passed before I finally drove to the hospital. The waiting room smelled of coffee and disinfectant, the kind of mix that sits in your throat. My father was sitting up in bed flipping through a crossword puzzle. When he saw me, his eyes softened in that way that used to mean everything was going to be okay. "Hey, kiddo," he said. "Didn't think you'd come." He looked smaller somehow. The strong lines of his face, now gentler, worn down by time, and something else, maybe regret, maybe just age. We talked about nothing important. The weather, my job, how quiet the town had become. He avoided the topic we both knew hung between us. After a while, I asked how Mom was handling things. He hesitated. "She's managing," he said. "We're getting by." I stayed for an hour, then said my goodbyes. As I turned to leave, he reached for my hand. "She misses you, Nora. She talks about Avery all the time." His voice cracked slightly. "You don't have to forgive her, but maybe, just maybe, try to see that she thought she was helping." Outside, the air felt colder than it had going in. I stood by my car for a while, letting the wind sting my face before driving home. Avery was waiting up when I walked in. "How was it?" she asked. I told her he seemed okay, that he looked older than I remembered. She nodded, studying my face. "Did Grandma call while you were there?" "No," I said. "And she won't." The next morning, a letter was slipped under our front door. No return address, but the handwriting was hers. I opened it at the counter, my hands steady, despite the pounding in my chest. The letter was short. "I heard you visited your father. That means a lot. We're still family, Nora. We all make mistakes. Don't let pride ruin what's left." I folded it neatly and set it aside. That afternoon, Avery found it while tidying the kitchen. She didn't ask to read it, but I saw her eyes pause on the familiar handwriting. She pressed her lips together, then slid it back under the pile of mail. Later that week, we got another message, this time through Aunt Joyce. She said my parents were preparing to move again, downsizing to an even smaller place. "They can't keep up with rent," Joyce said softly. "Your mom wanted you to know they're selling some things." She hesitated before adding, "She's listing your grandmother's piano." That piano had belonged to my grandmother on my father's side, a heavy oak upright that used to sit in their living room, the same one Avery learned to play on when she was little. I could still remember the sound of her small fingers hitting the keys, the notes uneven but full of joy. Avery overheard the conversation from the hallway. "They're selling it?" she asked. "The one from their house," I nodded. She looked down for a moment, her jaw tightening. That was the only thing that ever felt real in that house. The next day she asked if we could drive by the old place one more time before the move. I wasn't sure why, but I agreed. When we pulled up, the yard looked empty. A few boxes sat near the porch, and through the window I could see my mother directing 2 movers toward the piano. Avery sat quietly in the passenger seat watching. Then she whispered, "Can we go?" We drove in silence most of the way home. About halfway there she said, "You know, I don't want it back. Not the money, not the piano, none of it. I just wish they'd admit it was wrong." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't reopen everything we'd tried so hard to close. That evening, I found her sitting at the piano bench in our living room playing softly. It wasn't the same instrument, but the melody was familiar, a tune she used to play when she was small. When she finished, she looked over at me. "I think I understand them now," she said quietly. "They loved what I could give, not who I was." She said it without bitterness, just truth. And in that truth, something shifted again. The hurt didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling the room. A week later, Avery left for Chicago. We stood at the bus station in the cold morning air, her bag slung over her shoulder. "You okay?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Yeah," she said. "It feels good to start somewhere new." As the bus pulled away, I felt both pride and sorrow, pride that she'd built herself back up, sorrow for the years she'd spent doubting her own worth. Back home, the house felt too quiet. The first snow of January began to fall, dusting the porch and the steps. I sat by the window watching it cover the street, thinking about all the ways life can strip you down and still leave space for rebuilding. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation, just distance, and in that distance a kind of justice neither courtroom nor apology could ever give. Still, part of me knew this chapter hadn't truly ended, because while the wounds had closed, the scars had only just begun to teach us what healing really meant, and that I suspected was the hardest lesson of all. Spring arrived slowly that year, the kind that creeps in with soft rain and hesitant sunlight. By then, Avery was deep into her research program in Chicago, balancing long days at the university with weekends spent exploring the city. We spoke often, her voice steady and content, the kind of peace that sounds like someone finally breathing on their own. I missed her, of course, but watching her grow into herself was its own kind of comfort. The quiet house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. One evening, I found an old photo while cleaning the hall closet. It was taken in my parents' backyard years ago. Avery was about 6, holding a sparkler, her face lit by the glow, and my mother stood behind her smiling. For a long time, I just sat on the floor staring at it. There was a time when that picture would have made me ache for what we'd lost, but that night I saw it differently. It wasn't proof of a happy family that fell apart. It was a moment that was real, even if everything after it changed. Not long after Aunt Joyce called again. She said my parents had finally left Cedar Ridge, moving closer to my sister's town. "Your mom mentioned they're keeping to themselves," she said. "She still tells people she just wanted to help." Her voice carried no judgment, only fatigue. I thanked her for letting me know, then asked her not to bring them up again. I didn't say it unkindly, I just meant it. The story was finished. A week later, Avery came home for a visit. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in the way life shows on a person, when they've started to understand their own strength. She unpacked her bag in the kitchen, talking about her classes, the friends she'd made, the small apartment she loved, because it was completely hers. "Do you ever think we'll talk to them again?" she asked suddenly, her voice calm but curious. I poured her a cup of coffee before answering. "Maybe," I said. "But if we don't, that's okay too." She nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing her lips. "I used to think forgiveness meant letting people back in," she said. "Now I think it just means you stop letting them take space they don't deserve." We spent that weekend together doing nothing special, making dinner, watching old movies, laughing at scenes we'd both memorized years ago. On Sunday morning, she sat at the piano, her hands moving easily over the keys. The melody was simple, familiar, something she used to play as a child. The sound filled the house soft and unhurried, and I felt a warmth settle where anger used to live. It wasn't joy exactly. It was quieter, more like peace finding its way in through an open window. That night after she'd gone to bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of rain and lilacs, and the world felt still. I thought about how far we'd come, the courtroom. The whispers, the long silences that once felt unbearable. Justice hadn't come with fanfare or applause. It came in small, steady ways, a clean night's sleep, a daughter unafraid to ask questions, a home finally free of performance. I realized something then. What we'd fought for wasn't just fairness, it was dignity, the right to tell our story truthfully, even when others twisted it. The courage to choose peace over pretending, the strength to build something new from the pieces left behind. When people talk about closure, they make it sound like a door you shut. But for us, it wasn't about closing anything. It was about walking through and deciding not to look back. The past would always exist, but it didn't own us anymore. Avery left for Chicago the next morning, her suitcase rolling softly across the porch. Before she got in the car, she turned and hugged me tight. "Thanks for never letting me believe being kind means being weak," she said. I held her close, my voice catching a little when I told her, "Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's surrender." She smiled at that, then drove away, her taillights disappearing down the quiet street. I stood there for a long moment, watching the sunlight stretch across the pavement. The world felt wide again, full of calm possibilities. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for another apology or explanation. I was just living. Sometimes I still think about that red heart Avery typed in the memo line the night she transferred her savings for surgery. Hope you're okay. It used to break me. Now it reminds me of who we are, women who love deeply, even when that love gets used against us. Women who learn eventually that the truest kind of love is the one that protects as much as it gives. If you've ever had to rebuild after betrayal, I hope you know this healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without letting it hurt anymore. It means knowing your worth doesn't depend on who sees it. Thank you for listening to our story. If it stayed with you, take a moment to breathe, reflect, and maybe share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your peace.